None of my friends ever witnessed the true him. He was very good at concealing that. Life just seemed to be better than it had been before.
I always felt as though she was somebody who could look after herself.
And it just seemed too good to be true, which was very much what it was.
It lives in secrecy. You just don't know what that person is going to do.
I already knew he had a hell of a temper on him, and I didn't know what he was capable of. And that was the beginning of 8 hours being held against my will. Looking back, I'd have what most people would think was a stable upbringing. Family life was stable, education. I went on to university, met my ex-husband when I was working and living in London. We got married in my late 20s and then essentially spent my 30s having children. And married life was very much what many people would consider normal. The mix of school runs, looking after children. Over time, the relationship broke down, and I knew I wanted to leave the marriage, but I just didn't know how.
I've known Rhianon for about 15 years when she lived close by. We clicked straight away. She's bubbly and good fun. We would go for long walks, or we would cook meals and we'd get together with friends. She spoke frequently about Wales and her love of Wales and would come home very often to see her family.
The family house in North Wales had always been the place that felt like home for me. And it's not just the place and the location, but the lifestyle as well. It's a small holding, looking after animals, riding, walking in the countryside that we're surrounded by. It's the seclusion, the space, the views, being between the sea and the mountains that I feel really comfortable with. As the marital relationship was breaking down, I was realizing more and more that it was here, the family home, living rurally in North Wales was where I felt comfortable. I was feeling unhappy with the relationship. We'd really stopped being friends, and I didn't want to be in that situation for the rest of my life. And I thought about it really long and hard, because as far as I was concerned, nobody would be interested in a war-torn mother of four. I thought, if I am going, it'll be just me bringing up the children for the rest of my life.
She had said that she was kind of feeling unhappy and things were not quite right. She told me on the phone that she would be separating from her husband. So I was sorry to hear that her marriage had ended, but knew that she would be happier here in Wales.
And that's when fate took a tragic turn. I had a really close bond with my father. We'd always got on. We enjoyed lots of similar things. The lifestyle here. When I had come home, I'd help him with jobs, whether it was with the animals or around the place. He was just someone who got me. So when he was taken seriously unwell, it was without question that I knew I'd come home. Not just to make sure he was okay, but actually to look after the place whilst he was in hospital. I packed the car, picked up the children from school, and drove up here. Long journey, but I was never going to not make it. It transpired. It was a much more serious situation than I'd realized. As the situation developed, my father never made it out of hospital, and I never returned to the marital home. We've never left.
So when Rhianon left, it left quite a big hole, but I suppose we made up by calling each other and just catching up and seeing what she was doing.
We started our life in Wales then. And it suited me. I enjoyed being here. It's where I'd been happiest. The children started going to school. We really had become established in living here. Having moved away in a completely unplanned manner and settled in here at home in Wales, I realized that ending the marriage was the right thing, and it was what I needed to do. I was traveling back to the house, having left my father in hospital, when I had a puncture. It's a remote country lane, only about half a mile from home. That's when a man pitched up. Now, I didn't know him. I knew of him, but I did know he was a mechanic. So when he offered to change the tyre, I gratefully accepted. I just needed to get home. I was absolutely exhausted. It had been an incredibly long and emotional 24 hours. I didn't really think anything more of it. I wasn't expecting necessarily to even see him again. But he started turning up at home, offering help. And at the time, I was really grateful for that.
I first heard about him when she would mention that he would help on the farm.
He seemed to want to do anything he could that would help make life easier.
She had quite a bit on her plate. She was looking after her father. She was also trying to organise her children and sort schools and things like that. So I think after a time, I think it was obvious that he had become a bit more than just a friend.
As time went on, we'd do more together, whether it was going shooting, and living rurally, shooting is very much a part of normal life, or whether it was being on the small holding, and it was incredibly flattering that someone would want to spend time with me and that he wanted to be around and help out. It was much later the following year before I realised that he was interested romantically. He talked about past relationships and how he never felt that he'd find a woman who he'd settle down with. But actually, he talked about how much we had in common, and he told me that he'd never felt this way before. He rented a house in the village. He seemed to be the perfect partner, helping out around the place, the shared hobbies that we had together, and he'd also seemed interested in the children, seemed to want to make sure that their needs were being met.
He was really good for her. It really boosted her self-esteem. She just seemed a bit more confident. There was no kind of clash of personalities which she had previously with her ex-husband.
There was rarely a day when I didn't see him. He was spending more and more time here. Once it was official, I was really pleased to tell my friends about the relationship.
So I met him when I came up and visited Rhianon. My first impressions of him were that he was quite quiet, but he also seemed quite caring.
Life just seemed to be better than it had been before. My friends felt really happy for me. They knew I was where I was felt at home, and it just seemed too good to be true, which was very much what it was. Although I knew people locally, I hadn't got strongly established friends here. Looking back, I can see how it made me an easier target for him. You end up being in a situation where you're walking on eggshells, because I never knew when things might be going to kick off. You never knew when the temper swing was going to happen. And actually, having had a failed marriage, I really wanted this relationship to work. I did just want to be loved. For the first year, things seemed to be ideal. And it was only after that that I began to see his temper for the first time, see a mood swing. Not at first directed to me, but that was the first window of what might be to come.
Domestic abuse could be psychological, it could be financial, it could be many things. It's not something that happens overnight. It's a process, and it could be little things. I don't quite like what you're wearing. Would you fancy wearing something else? And then it would be like, I don't think you should wear that. And then, you know, over time, it's more controlling in the sense of you're not going to be wearing that.
The first time he lost his temper, it wasn't directed to me. It was nothing to do with me. But I remember being quite taken aback about how aggressive he was. It was almost like a barrier had been crossed. Once he'd lost his temper the first time, it then became more frequent. He became less interested in the children. From someone who'd been so invested in doing what he could to support them, I'd noticed a substantial change.
And that's the scary part, where children are involved. Always when there's a family dynamic and kids are involved, the decision to leave is a lot harder.
I think it was towards the end of 2015 when he ended the relationship for the first time. And I now know this is a classic controlling behaviour, which was devastating for me. I wondered what I could do to try and make things better.
Rhianon would talk about things that maybe they would break up and they would get back together. But leading up to that, she never indicated there was anything wrong in the relationship. Rhianon was very good at hiding what was actually going on, so wasn't aware of any kind of situations or problems.
I was being blamed one way or another for why the relationship had come to an end. The day after breaking up, he'd come back. We had to be together, he'd tell me. What we had was so good, it was too perfect to lose. And I believed him and thought, well, let's make this work. We need to make it work. After all, I'd been so lucky to be found by him, or so I thought. And that was the beginning of a cycle, one that would happen increasingly often, was him breaking up the relationship and then restarting it. It really makes you feel very unstable.
I think, unfortunately, the reason why domestic violence and domestic abuse still exist is it lives in secrecy. A lot of the times, the person will be isolated from their family and friends, and the victim will hide stuff, like whether it's bruises or whether it's I changed, but I don't want to let people know why I changed. But I've always said, you know, if you're on the outside and you feel something doesn't feel right, whether it's for a family member or a friend, keep a diary. Just notes the dates, and I noticed they had a bit of makeup on today and I felt like there was a bruise. You know, whatever it is, I think people would be shocked to know how sometimes, if it does go down the court route, that diary can be so important.
The reasons for the breakup were never his fault. It was always something else. Perhaps he was suffering stress, difficulties at work. Sometimes he blamed my children. And I now know again that actually that's very much the trait of this sort of behaviour, is never taking responsibility for what's happened. Towards the end of the relationship, I found it hard sometimes to keep track of whether things were on or off.
I was never concerned about Rhiannon's safety because I always felt as though she was somebody who could look after herself.
I can remember being asked by a friend afterwards, did he ever hit you? Well, there's so much more to abuse than being physically hit. He did become increasingly violent, and more often than not, there was the threat of what could potentially happen next. And that's enough. That's enough in this sort of controlling behaviour, the controlling relationship, for you not to risk it. You're never quite sure what's going to happen, but you know you want to avoid it. Because it increased gradually over time, looking back, I can see how I normalised his behaviour. Actions that, to start off with, would have been enough for me to walk away, meant that I didn't, because I'd become used to him, the increasing aggression, the increasing mood swings, and I'd become more reliant on him as he isolated me from the community, from friends.
I think it was quite hard for me to fully realise there were any major problems because of the distance between us, so I wasn't here, like, on a regular basis to see what was going on.
It's a really difficult situation to understand from the outside. It's not a situation I would ever have understood before I experienced it myself. Why you don't just walk away and why you allow this sort of situation to continue. You are not in control. They're totally controlling the whole thing.
I always say bullies can sense their victims, you know, and if you're vulnerable or you're going through a time when you're feeling not as confident or feeling a little bit low, it's very easy for the perpetrator to pick up on that. It can happen to anyone, very confident people and people who may be going through a vulnerable time. People do blame themselves, but they shouldn't, because the perpetrators know exactly what they're doing, and they actually rely on you feeling stupid, because then you won't say anything.
One of the things he'd do during the relationship, and it's a classic controlling behaviour I now know, was to threaten suicide. The first time he did it, I was devastated, absolutely devastated. And a short while after he'd left, I phoned a friend, a local friend, not knowing what to do. And they said that it was really odd that I said that because he'd been at theirs about half an hour before and seemed fine. It was pretty confusing for me. But I realised after he'd done it half a dozen or so times that actually he was doing it to cause me pain, to cause me distress. None of my friends ever witnessed the true him. He was very good at concealing that. And when people visited, you'd have the charming person, lovely, really happy to help out. So that's very much what they took he was like. It's a classic narcissistic trait to spoil special occasions. So looking back now, I can see how his ending the relationship on Christmas Day and screaming at me for a couple of hours and other significant occasions would have actually almost fed his coercive control more. And the final time it ended, it was very likely to have restarted again if it wasn't for the fact that he lost his temper in front of friends.
Rhianon had called me to say that after this series of breakups that she had made the decision to finish things. So at this point, she did tell me about the time that she had some friends over.
He'd ended the relationship, and I told him to stay away from this place, which was something I always did and something that he'd ignored, as ever. He came back when friends were here and lost his temper. He was screaming that I was a terrible person and what a hard time he was having. Then he picked up a sheet of Perspex and smashed it on the child's football goal. I remember the shards being all over the ground and me thinking, I need to pick those up, the children will cut their feet. And I turned to my friend who looked aghast and she said, that was awful. And without missing a beat, I told her, nothing, I'm used to it. And that's when she said, this ends now, Rhianon, you've got children to protect. I told my friend bits about things as the relationship had gone on, but until she witnessed it for herself, I don't think she really realised what it was actually like.
So that was the first time I'd heard of anything of that seriousness. I was shocked it's kind of gone to that level.
Having someone else witness his temper and having them tell me that things had to end made me strong enough to stick with that decision. That was the final end of the relationship.
When your friend says to you that she wants to end a relationship, you just think that is it, that's the end of it.
He never accepted that. It became incredibly intense.
I think there's a number of things that you need to look at in relationships. If it feels overwhelming to the point where you think, wow, I can't breathe, a little bit of a red flag. Mood swings, definitely red flag, big red flag. Wanting to constantly be with you, red flag. You may realise all of a sudden, hold on, I'm not spending any time with my friends or my family and stuff like that, red flag. But it's so difficult because when you're in something, hindsight, as we all say, is a great thing. But I do think that it's just to be aware of that these things may potentially be taking you down a road that you don't want to go down.
Because his violence had become gradually worse and I'd normalised it, his incredibly severe temper swings, I actually didn't think much of them. I can see looking from the outside how shocking that was, but actually when you become used to a situation, when that abuse becomes your normal, it doesn't stand out. So that friend witnessing his temper loss was a really essential reality check for me. So unwittingly, I'd been in an abusive relationship for 5 years and I hadn't known about it.
If you're feeling vulnerable and there's somebody who is just showering you with attention, with what you perceive to be love, you're going to really soak it up because at that point in your life, that's what you need to boost your confidence. So once again, perpetrators know this. They know that if I do X, this is what the result is going to be. And I just think that victims shouldn't blame themselves at all, because who doesn't want to feel great and loved and complimented and treated and all of the great stuff that we all like in a relationship?
I think I started to realise that wasn't going to be the end of it when the stalking began and when she realised she was kind of being watched or being followed.
I'd been out one night late, the children were away with their father, and I came back home. I'd been drinking, but I wasn't drunk. And as I walked up the track to where we are, I put one foot onto the cattle grid into here, and he ambushed me. He jumped out. He'd been hiding inside our walls.
I was on the phone to Rhianon, and she was coming up onto her track to the farm. I could hear her voice change, and she became quite nervous, and I knew something wasn't quite right. She said he was there, and I just said to her, you know, just keep on the phone. And I could hear there was a conversation happening.
I was terrified. I already knew he had a hell of a temper on him, and I didn't know what he was capable of.
I was feeling concerned, and I told her to stay on the call just to let me know that she was okay.
I managed to get past him and go into the house. He never listened to me asking him to leave me alone.
At this point, I was telling Rhianon it's a really good idea for you to just document these instances, and just so you've kind of got a record of what's been happening.
He'd turn up here. He'd follow me on roads. I remember him curb crawling me. And his message was constant. We had to be together. We were meant to be together. He'd say everybody wanted us to be together. It wasn't the case at all. I didn't feel particularly scared because I'd become used to his behaviour. And at that stage, it wasn't as aggressive as it later became. But I was never left alone. And for me, it was that act by him that triggered me thinking I had to go to the police. I thought they'd have a quiet word and tell him to leave me be. I had no idea what would happen. I went to the police station, and when I was giving my statement, I felt more and more stupid. I was talking about things that had happened during the relationship, and the officer said to me, "That's harassment, that's common assault, that's coercive control." I had had no idea that I was in an abusive situation. He then went on to tell me that he would be arrested and that his guns would be taken away from him whilst they investigated the situation. He was arrested 2 weeks later for harassment and menacing behaviour. His guns were taken from him, and he was told not to contact me. A few hours after being arrested the first time, he was let go. He was back in the village and furious. Things had really taken a turn. He was now very angry about what had happened, and he was much more threatening in his behaviour. So the following week, he was arrested for witness intimidation. The stalking continued intensely, and there was a very strong underlying aggression to it. He had no respect for authority. So having been arrested 3 times in 3 weeks, matters went to the Crown Prosecution Service. The result that came back was no further action. I can remember feeling terribly let down and getting really upset. But now he was much more aggressive, much more threatening. And in his mind, I'd humiliated him by having him arrested, when that hadn't been the case at all. Because he was getting worse and I could see that being arrested hadn't stopped him, I had a CCTV camera put up. Friends said to me, "Oh, you won't need it." But I thought, no, I know him. I know him. He's not going to go away. As time progressed, and over the following weeks, as the stalking intensified and the threatening behaviour intensified, I was literally just waiting for something to happen. I'd gone back to the police. I didn't know what more I could do. I was telling them what was happening, but what there weren't, because we lived rurally, there weren't witnesses to his behaviour. I was absolutely on my toes. I never knew when he'd appear, where he'd appear. And there's some sort of way that when you saw him, it was a slight relief, because at least then I knew exactly where he was. He was a threat to me, and he was a threat to my children. And I never stopped reporting to the police. I'd been told from the beginning, keep collecting evidence, tell us what's happening. The middle of August 2019, the children were away with their father. During the evening, I went down to a neighbour's. I pulled up at the neighbour's house and he was at my window, banging on the window, telling me we just had to talk. I ignored him and went in and thought nothing more of it. I was so used to being stalked that him being there almost hadn't bothered me. You get used to feeling threatened. It's a very bizarre situation. So I returned home shortly before midnight, pulled up where we parked the cars. I got out and walked around to the front of the car. And that's when it happened. He ambushed me for the second time. Jumped out, camouflage gear, black shooting gloves, and held a shotgun to my chest.
So in a rural setting, it's not unusual for people to own guns, and I was aware that Rhianon and her ex-partner would go out shooting. I just didn't believe that her ex-partner would be capable of holding her at gunpoint.
I remember screaming. It's a gut reaction. There's no one to hear you scream. I remember being shocked but not surprised. I knew he was getting worse. And that was the beginning of 8 hours being held against my will. When he ambushed me, he was furious, absolutely fuming. He was accusing me of all sorts of things that hadn't happened, accusing me of infidelity when I'd never even held another man's hand. The message was really clear. He was furious and he was in control, and that there was only one way out. We were going to be out together or not at all.
The most dangerous time for any person going through domestic violence is when the perpetrator has recognised that they've lost the control. So many people will say, oh, why don't they just leave? But leaving is when it's the most dangerous.
People ask, how did I get through those 8 hours? And there are two things that I say. One is that an adrenaline is an amazing thing and the body wants to protect itself. And the other is to remember that I had had 5 years of training at his hands, increasingly learning to modify my behaviour to try and give him the right answer, to appease him. And it was that, on hyperdrive that night, that I think got me through it. I can remember at one point early on asking if I could go to the house to get a coat, and that was never allowed. I was never going to be allowed to the house. The first 15 or so minutes, we were by the camera. And it was at that stage that he decided we'd move to the barn. He was intensely aggressive. There was no question of this. It was absolutely everything was to be his way. And I did believe he was going to kill me then. His finger was on the trigger, the barrel was at my chest. It's a weapon that I knew and that I've used. It's got a very fine trigger. I just remember constantly being on my toes, constantly trying to give the right answer to an aggressive man who's got a gun at your chest. So we went together to the barn. He got a bale out for me to sit on. Even though this had gone on for several hours, and I know looking back how exhausted I was becoming, the adrenaline just keeps you going. The next 5 hours was the most extraordinary time. It was like an incredibly intense version of what I'd experienced during the relationship. At times it was full aggression, and I thought that was going to be it. At others, he seemed to be trying to make me pity him in how he behaved. I can remember him asking me, if I went to the house, what would I do? Would I call the police? Well, I knew to say yes was the wrong thing. And I also was thinking, well, what's the point of going to the house? Even if I'd locked a door, you could get through it with a shotgun fairly easily. And if I had called the police, they'd have never got here before it was too late. I could just remember thinking, I've just got to stay alive. You're constantly assessing risk and constantly trying to find the safest thing to do in that moment.
The whole thing was really surreal. And I think the distance makes you just feel as though you're really quite removed from what is kind of going on and what's happened.
But he was also saying how we had to be together, how I would never be with anyone else, and how he was going to kill me and then kill himself. It was a very real threat. Your life's about to end, and there's nothing you can do about it. Towards the end of the time that he held me in the barn, he mentioned he had an appointment the next day. It had come to light because he said he'd miss it. He was going to blow his brains out. There'd be nothing of him left. And for whatever reason in that moment, I said that I'd had one too. And it was then that he said I should mention that I'd been puffy. The stress that night meant that my breathing wasn't quite right. But it was my first glimmer of potential hope. The first time that there was any suggestion that I may be allowed out and that I may survive. I had no concept of time, but it was beginning to get light. And that's what meant he said that we'd have to move soon. He felt there might be people around. Unlikely, given how isolated we are, but it wasn't a risk he wanted to take. And that's when he told me we were leaving. He told me we'd go to his house, and it's as we went through the garden gate that I remembered the camera. I'd been oblivious to it before, and I can remember thinking, he can't know about it. If he'd known about it, he'd have done something to it, and he'd have boasted about that. It's got a ring of lights on it, and all I could think about was that he was going to see it, and that would be it. If he'd been angry before, he was going to be absolutely furious when he noticed that. He'd never liked being recorded. He got into the car and smacked the dash cam I had up out of the way. I drove down to his house, and it's only a few minutes into the village, but I can remember it feeling so intense and thinking, what's going to happen? What if someone sees us? The house he was in was at the end of a cul-de-sac, and I wasn't allowed to go up there. He made me park on the main road. He seemed to come down slightly once we were at his house. And I wonder if that's because in his mind, he'd got what he wanted. Although I'd never said it, as far as he was concerned, we would be together. About an hour before my appointment was due, he told me I must need some rest, and we were in his sitting room. I sat in one chair and he was on the chair across from me. He told me I must need some sleep. There was nothing more removed from what I could do. I remember half shutting my eyes, never wanting to switch off completely, always wanting to make sure I knew what he was doing, where he was, and watching the clock. As he got near 8 o'clock, I remember him standing up and coming over to me and telling me it was time for me to go now. And we went to the front door. He almost seemed quite cheerful, like he'd got what he wanted. I remember him telling me I mustn't tell anyone else that we were back together, that we'd meet up, go for a spin, but not tell anybody else. And I remember as I left the front door and walked down the road, I remember thinking he might shoot me in the back and trying to work out, what do I do now? I knew from experience that the police station wouldn't be open. I knew that if I tried to stop to find a mobile phone signal to call the police, I may not have time. I fully expected he'd follow me. I knew my abuser. I couldn't take the risk of him not thinking I was doing exactly what he wanted me to do, to go to that doctor's appointment and then to meet him afterwards. I parked in the car park opposite, and as I crossed the road, that's when I began to lose it. In that reception, I can remember saying I've got an appointment with the nurse, but can I see my GP too, please, if they've got time? I can't have looked my best. Instead of waiting in the waiting room, they put me around the corner, made me a cup of tea, and I waited. I went to see the nurse for my appointment, and as she showed me out, I asked if I could not go downstairs. I'd said I didn't want to go to the waiting room. There might be someone there I didn't want to see, because I thought he'd follow me down. And as I was saying that, the GP called me into their room. And I remember sitting down and saying, I think I'm going to take longer than your 10 minutes. And I said, I don't know what to do now. If I go back to the police and they don't do enough, that's it. But if I don't go to the police, I've got to lead this weird, twisted lie life, and I can't see how I can keep the children safe. And at that point, the utmost professional, she said, this is totally out of your hands. I have a duty of care. She called the police immediately. There was a slight delay because of firearms. They didn't know whether he may have them or not, and the surgery was locked down. I was told later, when he was arrested, a short while afterwards, it was in the surgery car park.
So when she told me she'd been held overnight and just happened to escape by going to a doctor's appointment, just completely shocked. So on this phone call, she seemed quite frantic and obviously just very, kind of shocked, speaking really quickly. I think she was just in kind of disbelief this had just happened to her. It just seemed very surreal.
A few hours later, I was taken to a nearby station and again, in more depth, went through what had happened. I hadn't even thought about the camera. It was almost an afterthought. And it was later on Friday that an officer came here to see if the camera had recorded. But I remember the comments made when they looked at the screen. Oh, it's a good quality camera. You can see his fingers on the trigger. You can see your emotions. It's obvious to see you're terrified. Horrific, but essential. Because without that footage, he'd never have been convicted. His word against mine, it had never happened. The evidence was crucial. I was told that by the police 24 hours following. In fact, the investigating officer kept saying, and looking shocked while she said it, "You're so lucky to be alive." It was later in the weekend that I was told he would be charged and that the CCTV evidence had been crucial.
I would advise anyone to keep a diary. If they have a neighbour, to try and work out a safe word. That means for them to call the police, to get in contact with organisations that can help them in regards to when they do leave, they've got somewhere to go. The problem for me, though, is like anything, it's a chicken and egg situation. Because sometimes, unfortunately, as we know, some people have lost their life because that help has not been able to be given in time. There are some great police forces that do some great work and have some really good domestic violence officers who are specifically trained in that area. Build up your evidence in the background. And when you're feeling strong enough and ready to go to the police, I think you need to have a plan because you may not be able to return to your home.
So Rhianon called to tell me that he had been sentenced. I felt relieved that she had now got some respite from the stalking and the ordeal that she'd been going through.
I remember feeling relieved, thinking, well, we should be okay now. We should be safe.
I know so many people who've been stalked before. Myself, I've been stalked. It's so frightening because you just don't know what that person is going to do. And that's the bit, I think, for victims. It's the unknown. It's the constant threat of doing something. And then you become a prisoner. You know, we've now got stalking laws, which is great, but they don't go far enough.
He was sentenced in February 2020 for false imprisonment, for threats to kill, possession of a firearm with intent, and stalking. And that's when he was given a prison term with an extended sentence following it. It felt like a relief that he'd been sentenced and I knew that we'd be safe while he was in prison, but it was never going to be long enough.
The Ministry of Justice says that will face years of strict supervision. Rhianon has no choice but to put her faith back into the authorities that have already failed her.
Watching the footage, it was really quite shocking and made it very real. I could see the fear in Rhianon's face, and equally I could see the anger in her ex-partner's face. So once I had seen the CCTV footage, it was at that point I realised how serious it had been. So after this incident, I was checking in with her quite frequently. She would call or I would just kind of make sure she was okay.
There's been no respite. As I've come to learn more myself about coercive control, about domestic abuse, about what changes there, I feel, could and should be within the criminal justice system, about raising the profile of these issues, it's almost become my life's work. And supporting the children as best I can, that we can all heal from his abuse.
I'm impressed with how Rhianon has coped with the situation, and I think she's much braver than she thinks. She is channeling her energies and trying to make people aware of the situations that are occurring every day. She's speaking with governments, she's talking to the police to help them better understand things that they can put in place to kind of help protect other people.
Most of the cases I deal with, the person doesn't live. So for me, I was happy because she's alive to tell her story. It affects so many people that people don't realise it. It doesn't just affect the main victim. If you've got kids, it affects, it's a whole massive ripple effect.
So looking back, I can see that these issues will never leave me.
I could see why Rhianon didn't share what was fully happening in her relationship. I think she'd had a failed marriage and she wanted this relationship to work. I think society has an assumption that these kind of situations happen to certain type of people, but I think this shows it can happen to any of us.
I was vulnerable, I was isolated. He was able to assess very quickly how easy it would be to manipulate me, and he paved the way for his future abuse from the outset.
Rhianon didn't do anything wrong. At the end of the day, I think Rhianon was targeted.
I'm very happy here with the children. I hope we're on a path of healing, of growing, and of beginning to recover from the horrific abuse he put us through.